All right. Cool. Good to go when you are.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this lecture. It's called Disability, a Social Justice Issue Within Human Rights Frameworks. And what we're trying to do here is locate the right to education within international frameworks of human rights, understand how it is that our country and our government is committed to fulfilling those human rights and how we can make government accountable for the right to education. We're also going to go on to talking a little bit about the crisis in South African education for children with disabilities as a backdrop to this, and so thinking about how human rights frameworks can help us in making government accountable for addressing the crisis in South African education for disabled children. And then we'll also say a little bit about critiques of human rights discourse and where it might fall short in some ways. Okay, so let's get right into it. Number 2. I want to start by arguing for the reality of disabled people being an oppressed minority who suffer socially engendered disadvantage. And then see the exclusion of disabled people from education as, if you like, a subset of that broader socially engendered disadvantage. But firstly, let's just consider disabled people as a minority and what predicament they are in. What do we know about the predicaments that disabled people are in around the world? We find that wherever we look around the world, and even more so in the global south, that disabled people are to be found on the bottom rung of the socioeconomic ladder, more often than not. Amongst disabled people, there are extremely high levels of unemployment, sometimes of the order of 80%, 90%, and more. In fact, as one example, think about visually impaired or severely visually impaired people in South Africa are estimated to have an unemployment rate of 97%. That's estimated by the South African National Council for the Blind. So enormously high rates of unemployment. And consequently, what always goes with that, amongst disabled people around the world, very high rates of poverty. For disabled people who have jobs, it's likely that the income will be in the lowest decile, and that means the lowest 10%. If you have a job as a disabled person, it's likely that 90% of other employed people in your society earn more than you do. What goes along with that, and this is getting to be particularly important for us, the disabled people around the world tend to have extremely low levels of educational attainment. In other words, have left school having with low levels of attainment from their schooling, or have not been to school at all, have been completely excluded from the schooling system. Besides all of these disadvantages, we also see structural exclusion in the provision of essential services by governments. Well, education is an essential service, but add to that the following: accessible housing, the absolutely crucial issue of accessible and appropriate healthcare for disabled people, access to information, which has all kinds of implications for citizenship rights, transportation, which is an enormously important resource for access to the economy and the possibility of becoming employed. So in all of these respects, we see a pattern of disabled people suffering contraventions of fundamental human rights. And because these represent contraventions of human rights, they also represent contraventions of international conventions on human rights to which many countries, including South Africa, are signatories. These international conventions function as laws in the countries which are signatories to them. In other words, if you've signed up to an international convention like the Declaration of Human Rights, its implications, its requirements, if you like, function as laws within your country, and the judicial system can be used to make your government accountable for what it is committed to in terms of signing up to international conventions. Here we are concerned with education, in particular the right to education. And so as I look at a couple of, well, the most important in the international conventions that we are signatories to, we're going to be focusing on education most specifically. Slide number 3. So, 3 international conventions that we are part of. Firstly, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And Article 26 of that International Declaration of Human Rights declares that everyone has the right to education. So everybody, irrespective of your identity, of disability, of your sexual orientation, of your color, of your religion, whatever the case may be, everyone has a right to education. Secondly, and narrowing it down more specifically to the disability community now, is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, signed and ratified by South Africa back in 2007. And there we see, in particular, with reference to education, Article 24, which recognized the right of education to all persons with disabilities. So it's specifically focusing on people with disabilities and saying, and there's a recognition here, and this is part of the whole motivation of the UNCRPD, is a recognition that disabled people as a group that's vulnerable to marginalization and exclusion need specific mention. And if you like, governments need to be guided and lent on specifically with regard to protecting the rights of disabled people. In terms of the UNCRPD Article 24, right to access to education for all persons with disabilities, it stipulates that the right will be realized without discrimination and based on equal opportunity. In other words, equal opportunities between people with and without disabilities. And interestingly, when we talk about the right to education here in Article 24, we're not just talking about the right to school education. And very often, I think, when we're talking about education, exclusion for education, we tend to forget that education doesn't just happen at school. It's not just about children. It's also about higher education and tertiary education. And I mean, and let me point out that what I'm saying here is that Article 24 also includes the right to equal opportunities in not only school education, but also higher education, tertiary education, vocational training, adult education, and lifelong learning. And so really, the idea is to protect the interests of disabled people, the right of disabled people to access to all forms of education throughout the lifespan. Slide number 4. The third convention which South Africa is subject to is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are a follow-on set of principles and ideals agreed to, a follow-on to the Millennium Development Goals, agreed to by many countries around the world. And the SDGs really represent a worldwide call to action to, first and foremost, end poverty, but also to protect the environment. And that is a relatively new, that's a new development path in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, and to ensure peace and prosperity for all. The Sustainable Development Goals, as I just mentioned, they do include new areas such as a recognition on caring for the environment, and in particular, the requirement of action around climate change. Also, actions around economic inequality, aiming to end poverty, and to encourage sustainable consumption, a protection of the earth and protection of resources. In the Sustainable Development Goals, disability, disabled people, and also people in vulnerable circumstances are mentioned many times. And this is important because disabled people were not mentioned in the Millennium Development Goals, which led to sort of quite an outcry. And because of that, there's been a clear recognition of the vulnerability of disabled people to exclusion and to poverty in the Sustainable Development Goals. In particular, focusing on education again, Sustainable Development Goal number 4, SDG 4, requires that countries ensure inclusive and equitable quality education. Inclusive and equitable quality education. Also, again, to promote lifelong opportunities. So again, an emphasis on education, which is not just at the school level, but right across the lifespan. It goes on to say, and this is important for us, I think, this is where we come in here as scholars in disability studies and education. The SDG 4 also says guaranteeing equal and equitable education by building inclusive learning environments and providing the needed assistance for disabled people. So really identifying clearly there that in order for disabled people, disabled children and adults to be included, not just included, but to really participate and achieve and succeed in education throughout the lifespan, there's a need to make environments accessible and ensure that there is capacitation of educational professionals to provide the necessary assistance to ensure that that not only access, but also equity and full participation and success is possible for people with disabilities in education across the lifespan. Slide number 5. So these three frameworks all have clear implications in the lives of disabled people. And the second two, the UNCRPD and the Sustainable Development Goals, really provide quite clear directives to a government such as ours regarding what it is accountable for in ensuring access to education for disabled people. Slide 6. So that's a broad international context of what government is accountable for, what government has signed up for, if you like, in terms of making education accessible. And by that I mean our government in South Africa. Let's think for a moment about the situation of education for children with disabilities in South Africa, which occurs against the backdrop of this of these international conventions and responsibilities that our government has agreed to. In terms of education for children with disabilities in South Africa, we are in an extraordinary crisis, an extraordinary state of crisis, where in 2016, according to government's own estimates, as many as 600,000 children with disabilities in South Africa were not in any form of schooling. Which is, I mean, it's an appalling state of affairs, you know, which is frightening at so many levels. It tells of the contravention, the blatant contravention of the rights of these children to inclusion in education. It also promises a legacy of exclusion into the future in terms of the possibility that this generation of children with disabilities will not be educated, will not have opportunities to develop a career, will be trapped in poverty, and that legacy of exclusion, which so often begins at school and then translates into exclusion from the world of work, that legacy of poverty and exclusion will continue. So that is in terms of children with disabilities who are currently not in any form of schooling. We have children who are in special schools, children with disabilities who are in special schools as well. But we also in that area, in that sector, we find enormous problems with special schooling. According to a number of reports, including one influential report by Human Rights Watch from 2015, which is one of your recommended readings, the state of our special schools for children with disabilities is really extremely dire. At these schools, at many of these schools, the levels of education and social conditions are of a very low standard. We have incidences of children who experience neglect and high incidences of abuse through lack of appropriate care and lack of sufficient professionals, care professionals and educational professionals at these schools. There's a general question, a general problem around the capacity of staff and the lack of training of teachers and other educational and support staff. The lack of training, specialized training in caring for and teaching children with specific disabilities. And so probably a vast majority of teachers who work in special schools in South Africa have had little or no specialized training in teaching children with particular impairments. Added to that is the fact that the infrastructure at many special schools is in a state of disrepair and could continue to deteriorate over recent years. And so we have a situation where enormous numbers of children are out of school. There are many children who are in special schools, but those special schools are functioning, many of those special schools are functioning at a very poor level, and levels of education are grossly inadequate. We also have large numbers of children who have been included in inclusive school settings in a sense by default, or that it is the policy. We'll get to that further on into the course. It is the policy of Education White Paper 6 is to move towards full inclusion of children with disabilities in ordinary schools and so-called full service schools. But in those circumstances, the extent to which children who have been included, children with disabilities who are in inclusive settings are fully catered for is limited and patchy as far as we know. Slide number 7. I would name 6 factors contributing to this crisis in South African education for learners with disabilities. The first one is incomplete or failed implementation of Education White Paper 6 across the nation. And Education White Paper 6, as I imagine you know or will be finding out over the course, is South Africa's inclusive education policy from 2001, which laid out a 20-year plan to create inclusive education for learners with disabilities. It provides for learners with disabilities being included in ordinary schools, which are transformed into full service schools in order to make them fully accessible and able to provide accessible and appropriate education for learners with disabilities. The model also provides for special schools, former special schools, to become centers of excellence, which support inclusive schools in their region in including learners with disabilities. So that's the plan. It was a 20-year plan, begun in 2001, and a central problem which leads us to where we are now in terms of the crisis in education for South African learners with disabilities is the fact that the plan of Education White Paper 6 has not been implemented properly. It's been implemented partially in some places, not in others. In some areas, government has done things which seem to be in contradiction of Education White Paper 6. And what that has led to is a situation where there's enormous amounts of exclusion, and there's a sense of inconsistency and a lack of clarity around where our education system for learners with disabilities is going, a lack of coherence about implementation of the policy. The second major issue leading to the current crisis is the lack of inclusive education training and support for teachers and principals. We lack the capacity to train teachers. Most of our teachers haven't been trained specifically in terms of providing for the needs of learners with disabilities in their classes. And we have a lack of specific tertiary training for teachers in the country. So a population of teachers who are working in the system who are untrained, and also a lack of appropriate training at sufficient scale in order to be feeding the system with new teachers who have the appropriate skills. The third part of the crisis facing us is problems with resources and infrastructure. I've spoken about this school infrastructure that is crumbling, a problem with lack of essential resources, learning and teaching and support materials for learners with disabilities, lack of provision of that appropriate LTSM, along with infrastructure which is crumbling, adding to the crisis. The crisis in access to education for learners with disabilities also happens against the backdrop of an education system broadly for all children, which is creaking and struggling and faces problems with capacity, faces problems with infrastructure, problems with resources. And so that needs to be added here, is that the crisis in education for learners with disabilities happens against the backdrop of broader problems with resourcing and infrastructure and capacity across the education system. The fifth reason for the crisis we face is a lack of understanding amongst professionals in the education system, and I mean teachers, principals, education officials, support workers and others, of the rights of the child and of the requirements of Education White Paper 6. In other words, a lack of understanding of what it is that professionals in our education system are responsible for, what they are required to do, what the law, the policy, as well as South Africa's participation in international conventions of human rights, what all of those things add up to in terms of the responsibility that professionals have to children with disabilities. There's a lack of understanding that children with disabilities have a right to full inclusion and what that means. The last factor adding to this crisis in education for disabled children is the reality of disabled prejudice, which gets enacted by communities and schools. And so exclusion, what I mean to say by this point is that prejudice, simple prejudice, disabled prejudice, is something which adds to the exclusion from schooling, from education of children with disabilities, who are just understood by communities and sometimes by education professionals themselves as children who lack potential, as children who don't belong there, as children who don't have a right to be there, in a way which adds to the risk for children with disabilities of being excluded. Slide number 8. All of this is in contradiction of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the South African Constitution. For example, the UNCRPD Article 24, I talked about earlier, which enshrines the right of education for all persons with disabilities, or the Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which requires of participating states that they ensure quality education as well as promote lifelong education. I'm sorry, I'll start that again. Ensure quality education as well as promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. So that from the Sustainable Development Goals. You will see, I mean, I know some of, I think I will know the students who are watching this interview by the time you see it. I hope I will have met you in person, or soon afterwards, I think probably in an online chat. But for those of you who don't know me, I am visually impaired, and I'm doing this lecture using a screen reader with an earphone in my ear, which I'm listening to what is coming from my PC. So if I trip up like I just did then, that's the reason why. It also contradicts the South African Constitution, in particular the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights broadly states that that the nation state may not unfairly discriminate directly or indirectly against anyone on the basis of one or more grounds, including all of these: race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, ethnic or social origin, color, sexual orientation, age, disability, interesting for us, religion, conscience, belief, culture, language, or birth. So our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, says in all of those respects that it is illegal to discriminate against anyone. And so the main point I'm making here is that at many levels, at the international level, in terms of the conventions on human rights, which South Africa has become a signatory to, as well as on the national level, the experience we see with the exclusion of children with disabilities from education is very clearly, at many levels, a contravention of basic human rights. And quite simply, it is discrimination. Slide number 9. So what I'm going to go on to now is saying a little bit about how the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is monitored. In other words, if we've signed up to this convention, which we did in 2007, signed up to all of its principles, and our government has said that it's going to do its best to implement those principles and protect the human rights and the right to inclusion of people with disabilities, how is that monitored or policed? That's the question I'm going to answer now. So monitoring of the UNCRPD around the world is achieved through the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Conference of States Parties. So the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is a committee that meets to make assessments of the submissions from various governments on the progress they've made in terms of implementing the requirements of the UNCRPD in their countries. So each country who's ratified the UNCRPD, like ours, must, in the first 2 years after signing the UNCRPD, submit a state report. In other words, a report which describes the status quo in terms of that government's progress in implementation of the requirements of the UNCRPD, all of its articles. So must submit a state report, the first one within the first 2 years of signing up, and then every 4 years after that, the government must submit a further report describing progress and also problems and plans in terms of continuing implementation of the requirements of the UNCRPD. So that's the state report. But importantly, the the UNCRPD also makes provision for each country to also provide what is called an alternative report. So where the government submits its report each cycle, the committee will also receive an alternative report, which is from civil society organizations in that country. And this is very important because what happens here is that as members of civil society, who are working in the disability sector, we get to read and evaluate the state report which is submitted, and then provide our own report based on our own evidence, which functions to some extent as a critique of the state report. Because of course government wants to make itself look good, and hopefully not sort of blatantly lying, but sometimes perhaps being a little bit economical with truth in terms of describing the situation on the ground in terms of the access or exclusion of people with disabilities. And so the opportunity for the alternative report allows civil society groups who are working in the interests of people with disabilities to submit their own report, responding to government's report, and in some way saying, yes, but we agree with that, but not really with that. That's true, but we'd like to add this. That situation is not quite as good as government thinks. We describe it in this way, and so on and so forth. So that's part of the kind of watchdog function, which the civil society report, the civil society report then has a kind of a watchdog function, which allows an alternative view of what's happening in a particular country to be communicated to the committee, not just the government's view. Through signing the UNCRPD, the South African government has, in effect, implemented its own accountability to international law. And that means that because government has signed up to the UNCRPD, we as citizens are able to hold government accountable for what it is committed to. And there are a couple of ways in which we can do that. One is through reporting to the United Nations, through, for example, the opportunity afforded by the alternative report to the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That's one way. But we can also make government accountable to what it has taken on through the UNCRPD. We can also make government accountable through our own judiciary by taking government to court and using the requirements of the UNCRPD as a benchmark in terms of what government is required to achieve, and where we see government not doing that, taking that issue to court and arguing that the judiciary needs to back us up in making government accountable for its commitments. Slide number 10. So I've said a lot about human rights and the international conventions on human rights. It's important to remember, though, that not everybody agrees in the utility, the usefulness of this human rights culture, human rights discourse, it's sometimes called. And it has been criticized. And so I'm going to say a little bit about that here, so we can think about it in an even-handed way. The first thing to say is that human rights discourse is a product of the global north. It comes, the United Nations is located in New York, and these ideas, the idea of human rights, is very much something which comes from the global north. And so while many critics, and often in particular critics from the global south, agree with the idea of human rights, agree that we all should have and do have the right to various resources, inclusion, services, and so on. And what these critics would say is that these rights don't necessarily have as much use in the global south, in global south contexts, as they do in the global north. And sometimes we see them as a bit more useful than they are to real people living on the ground in global south contexts. And the reason for that is because human rights are only meaningful if they can be enforced. Unless they can be enforced, they really are just words, or things which are written down on pieces of paper that have been signed. Without being enforced, they're not worth much more than that. And whether or not governments are able to implement human rights is going to depend on various things. The first thing is just the reality that governments will only be able to implement the requirements of human rights conventions they have signed if they have the resources to do so. So if governments don't have access to the resources needed in order to, for example, provide equitable access to education for children with disabilities, then there's, having signed up to the convention doesn't really mean very much. That's the first issue. The second issue is that human rights only live when citizens are fully aware of their human rights. In other words, citizens understand that they have rights and that they can make an argument. And in many places in the global south, where levels of education are low, where there is limited participation in what in the north would be thought of as kind of basic parts of citizenship, there in contexts such as that, where people don't necessarily understand that they have rights, those rights don't necessarily mean very much. The third issue is related to that, and that is to do with the fact that rights only have a real life if government can be made accountable for implementing those rights. And I was just saying earlier that one of the key ways in which we make governments accountable is through the judiciary. But using the judiciary, in other words, going to the courts to get the courts to make government fulfill its responsibilities, depends on whether or not people have access to those courts. Do people have access to legal representation? Do they have the means, the education to work through the courts to make governments accountable? Do those courts function? All of these are requirements which, in some contexts, global north contexts, are all taken for granted. In the south, things might be very, very different. The last point is that human rights also depend on government agencies being sufficiently free from corruption in order to implement services. And in countries where corruption is rife, the fact that one on paper has access to particular human rights doesn't mean that government can be accountable, can be made accountable for implementing those rights, because that accountability depends on a degree of integrity in the government, and if corruption is rife, that is not going to be present. So these critics say, well, if in many countries of the global south, the sorts of requirements for human rights being usable don't apply, and so if that is true, aren't we sort of kidding ourselves and saying that in valuing these human rights when in fact their utility to real people who face adversity in very difficult contexts of deprivation, their real utility to those people might be limited. Slide 11. If we think about the social model, which has been so pervasive in terms of the international disability movement, it itself is based on principles of human rights, or perhaps you could call them citizenship rights. In other words, it's based on the idea that we can make government accountable for creating a society which is more accessible. And sometimes in our prizing of the social model, we don't think carefully enough about whether or not implementation of creating an accessible environment, in other words, causing government to become accountable for its responsibilities, we don't necessarily recognize how feasible that is. It might not be very feasible. And in some ways, then problems with the social model reflect some of the critiques of human rights discourse. In one of your other lectures this week, I believe Judy is going to tell you a lot more about a particular case in South Africa, which is in which South Africa's ratification of the UNCRPD and South Africa's Bill of Rights was used to cause government through the judiciary to become responsible for providing for the needs of learners with intellectual disability. This is the case of an organization in the Western Cape called the Western Cape Forum for Intellectual Disability, who took action against government in 2010, legal action, because the South African government was not providing resources for the education of learners, children with intellectual disability. And that was based on the fact that in years gone by, there was a belief that children with intellectual disabilities were not educable, that they could not benefit from education. And based on this antiquated and very outdated belief, government was still not providing for these learners within the education system. In fact, children with intellectual disabilities were provided for just in terms of care through the Department of Social Development and not provided for at all through the Department of Education. So that's a case in which government was taken to court successfully by the Western Cape Forum for Intellectual Disability. Judy will tell you more about that case, but the only thing I want to point out here is that one thing which we discovered, which was very interesting about it, is that even though the case was won, and the court said yes to government, yes, government must provide for the needs, educational needs of these children with intellectual disability. In a way, that victory was just the beginning of a long process of having to support government through implementation of a new policy of inclusion, because government didn't have the capacity and had to be assisted and continues to be assisted by civil society organizations, higher education institutions, and so on, in order to implement education services for learners with intellectual disability. The point there is that sometimes we think that if we've won the battle in the courts, that then everything will follow kind of automatically. And what we've discovered is that, in fact, that is not the case. Government needs a lot more help and support and ongoing lobbying and campaigning in order to be made to fulfill its responsibilities. There's a quote here from Mahatma Gandhi. The measure of a society's humanity is reflected in how it treats its most vulnerable members. Yeah, I just thought I'd include that in the sense that it does say something very important here about the moral responsibility around education of children with disabilities who are extremely vulnerable. And the question of and the fact of the mass exclusion of learners with disabilities from education in our society at the moment must really be seen as the stain on our moral conscience, a stain on our democracy that it is. Slide number 12. A few thoughts about exclusion, on the legacy of exclusion of learners with disabilities in our society. As I alluded to earlier, the systemic exclusion of learners with disabilities from education in society takes place not only around the functioning of institutions, but also around prejudice, around disableism, and it gets life, and it's fed, I think, through prejudiced beliefs about the limited potentials of learners with disabilities, and prejudiced and discriminatory ideas about people with disabilities, children and adults, not having the right to full inclusion in our communities, in our schools, in our society. What these prejudices do is create situations in which learners with disabilities are excluded from education, and we have a situation of a legacy of exclusion which stretches, as I said earlier, from the school years into adult years, into exclusion from the world of work as well, and creating, if you like, self-fulfilling prophecies about the so-called limited potentials of people with disabilities. This is something we all need to be aware of in ourselves and in others, and fight with all we can. The ongoing mistreatment and exclusion of disabled people, from the ongoing mistreatment and exclusion of disabled children from education in our society is a stain on our democracy, and it's something urgent which we all need to work very hard to begin to address, and that's part of what this course is about. Thanks for listening. I'm going to leave it there.